So if you were watching the news sort of coming out of Halo Infinite, it kind of isn't really that big of a surprise that the game ended up launching with a lot of issues because you had a ton of news of things like important people leaving the project. And if you also watched what was going on with Forza Motorsports in a similar way, you kind of be seeing a bunch of red flags that maybe this project isn't going that well, but in different ways that I feel like were kind of hard to pick up unless you had kind of specific knowledge. Like, here's what I mean. I noticed in that first trailer that they launched that it was kind of weird that they focused on a Mazda race car, because not only was that from other games, that was also a type of race car that had been discontinued and replaced by a newer one, which had then also been replaced by an even newer one. So one of the cars that was in the first group they showed off was not only already in the series, but was basically 2 generations old when the game would launch, which was kind of weird. And when we did finally start seeing new things in that trailer and in the next one, they also really weren't that new. Like, they were already a few years old, and in some cases also from previous generations of race cars from the perspective of 2023 when the game would launch. Like, it was kind of weird how this game was sort of dating itself, because basically all they were showing was from at the latest 2021 when this was a 2023 release. Like, it really seemed like this game was supposed to come out 2 years earlier.
And just to be clear, I'm not saying like, oh, you make a new game, you have to only have new stuff. Just delete everything that's over a year old, because who cares? Or anything like that. Like, there are historically significant race cars in here that probably should be in here. But you look at how, they kept all this older stuff, and they only managed, I think, 2 race cars that are actually active right now. The newer Cadillac and the Corvette. And it kind of really just seems like they just couldn't get anything new. Like, you've basically lost the whole ability to drive cars you can see racing dynamic here. It's basically like making a sports game, but you for some reason have like 2 years outdated rosters that don't let you play as like new rookies that people are excited about. And it just seems odd for how long this game was in development.
I also noticed some kind of clever wording about the new cars, because they said that they were new to Forza Motorsport. That seemed very purposeful, because that means that they could consider cars new that were in Forza, but in the Horizons games. So they could, port stuff over, which was still work, but obviously less work, and say that they were brand new. And there were a decent number of cars they could do that for, since it had been 6 years since the last Forza Motorsport game.
They had, 2 Horizons games released since the last Motorsports one that they could bring cars over from, plus the updates and DLC.
That number also includes the 3 Cadillacs that are just reskins of each other. But I didn't really care that much about that, because I think around the same time I realized that, the track list showed up. And that quickly became basically the worst thing I had heard about this game, because there was so much stuff missing. And some of them are kind of understandable, like you're doing big visual reworks, just kind of getting rid of some tracks people don't really care that much about. Okay, that's fine. But getting rid of things like Sebring, Daytona, and Road to Atlanta, that not only are pretty notable racetracks, they're also basically the 3 most important North American tracks for the endurance racing that you've very clearly focusing a lot on endurance race cars from how you're marketing this thing. Like, you have one on the cover, but then you delete the 3 most significant North American endurance racing tracks from your game. Like, that's just such a notable and obvious drop in content that it really just isn't excusable. Like, this game just shouldn't have come out if you had to make this many cuts. But then there was also this weird thing that happened where they posted a video on Twitter of a car model that they were very clearly reusing from a long time ago. And that made a lot of people upset because it's like, okay, so you're really hyping this up after 6 years as this big visual improvement to the point where you're like justifying just not having tracks, but then you're still using these like ancient car models for this suit and like a Nissan as well. Like if you're fine with reusing content like this, then just put in the old tracks, maybe with just minor touch-ups, even if you have to like delete some other one to make way, just in terms of workload. And the fact that they are adding and stuff kind of has led to a bunch of theories that they're doing this because of Game Pass. Like, it's the same reason why there's this really weird thing with upgrades where you have to drive the car to, like, unlock new car parts instead of just being able to do whatever you want the minute you buy the car. Like, it's literally the type of thing that mobile phone games do to sort of push you to spend money just to be able to get these parts earlier. But that's not what this game is doing, so why is it here? Well, again, Game Pass. Like, they're trying to make people want to spend a large amount of time. Like, they're trying to keep people subscribed, both by having this drip feed of tracks to come back to, and having this part upgrade system to where you have to kind of spend hours grinding, like upgrade levels or whatever, to buy these parts that there was no barrier to before. And I should mention, there are still some good things, like in, the correct circumstances, this game does obviously look very good. In others, it kind of looks flat, but there's clearly been work to make this game look really good. Like, there's some good quality of life kind of stuff, like how you can change your starting position on the race grid with, like, differing rewards, which is really cool, and kind of an evolution of the whole difficulty thing, where you kind of got more money for raising the difficulty. Like, I always thought that was cool, because it actually gave you an incentive to do that, and to do things like, have a manual transmission instead of automatic or whatever, beyond the fact that it's just more engaging, more challenging. There was an actual reward for challenging yourself. So it's nice to see that concept being taken further. I also kind of feel like there's just kind of something missing in terms of gameplay improvement from the previous entries. Like, the thing about Horizons that I've kind of really liked is the whole event labs thing. Like, it's probably been the most fun I think I've had with like a user-generated content creation suite system since like Halo 3 Forge. And it's really done a lot to have there be more stuff to do in that game when you kind of get bored with just like the normal racing stuff. It feels like Forza Motorsport not having that is such a weird step back. Like, I know people get kind of annoyed when you compare these two series now, but it really just feels like there should be something to do if you kind of get bored of just normal racing over and over again, especially with the less tracks that they have. Like, I know people kind of made fun of like that old music mode Gran Turismo 7 had, but at least they like were trying to do something with like an alternate mode. Like, at least recognize the kind of problem, or not necessarily a problem, or I guess opportunity to have something more to do, right? And like, coming off of Horizons 2 Forza Motorsports, it really just feels like it's the same thing with Halo Infinite, or how that just didn't launch with Forge. It's just like, something's missing, just having a Forza in 2023 only having just the standard racing mode, and nothing really else. Like, it just feels so one note in sort of like an era of like gaming where it kind of feels like that's kind of becoming less acceptable for racing games. Like, the most recent Need for Speed had at least, things like police chases and stuff to make it more interesting, but also that whole unique framing of there being like races over a week and then that weekend thing where you can like bet on stuff. They just kind of added a lot more like context and sort of like an almost metagame sense. Like, I've heard like the take multiple times from people of just, what's the point in these kind of games when I could just like race in Grand Theft Auto if I want to or something. It's not really that relevant because it's kind of a different thing for like a racing sim kind of experience, but just there is a point of it's just becoming less tolerable for a game to just have, oh, you just do a standard race around a track and that's it. The $70, please. And this part of things really isn't even like exclusive to this game, like even I think GT7, kind of mentioned before, kind of suffers from that a little bit, and it's probably part of the reason why its sales haven't really been that great. I'm not necessarily saying it has to be like Event Labs for this, but like something like even in other games prior, it feels they've noticed they need to do stuff like this because they added stuff like drag racing and multi-class racing to these games. So like they know you need to do more to keep people interested, but they just kind of didn't really do that. Like if they had some extra mode or something, I think it would be more tolerable that they didn't get these tracks in, because at least there's something interesting new to do in these tracks that they have brought over. In kind of, again, the same way with like Halo Infinity, where I don't think people would have really cared that much about things like not having Forge mode if they just had like a really good, interesting campaign that actually used the open world well, which they kind of didn't do. I mean, there isn't even like a split screen mode. That's how little options there are, and it's also another similarity between this and Halo Infinite.